The sound of the slap cracked through the ballroom like a whip, and every head turned at once. Grace Bennett stood frozen, her cheek burning red, her hand rising slowly to touch the spot where Charlotte Ashford's palm had landed. The music from the string quartet faltered for a moment, before the musicians forced themselves to keep playing, pretending not to notice the scene unfolding near the entrance. Grace had walked into the Whitfield Corporation gala, carrying nothing but a folder of last-minute contracts, sent by her boss because the courier had called in sick. She had not expected to see anyone she knew. She had not expected to see him. Daniel Whitfield stood only a few feet away, his arm linked with Charlotte's, his tuxedo pressed to perfection, his expression suddenly drained of color. For 8 months he had wondered where Grace disappeared to. For 8 months he had told himself it did not matter anymore. And now she was standing in front of him, 7 months pregnant, her hand pressed against her belly, as if to shield the child from the humiliation happening around her. Charlotte's voice sliced through the silence, sharp and cold. "Get out of my way," she said, staring at Grace, as though she were nothing more than a stain on the marble floor. "I do not have time for hired help blocking the entrance." Grace opened her mouth to explain that she worked for the events company handling the paperwork, that she was only trying to deliver documents to the front desk, but the words caught in her throat. She looked past Charlotte and locked eyes with Daniel, and in that instant, something passed between them that no one else in the room could understand. Recognition, shock, and underneath it, something that looked dangerously like guilt. Daniel took half a step forward, his mouth opening as if to speak her name, but he stopped himself. Charlotte's fingers tightened around his arm, and he remained silent, caught between the woman he was engaged to and the woman carrying a secret he had never known existed. Grace lowered her eyes first. She would not give the room the satisfaction of watching her cry. She straightened her spine, adjusted the folder against her chest, and walked past Charlotte without another word, her low heels clicking against the polished floor as she made her way toward the exit. Whispers followed her the entire way, quiet but cutting, the kind of whispers that spread through a room faster than fire. Outside, the cold evening air hit her face, and she finally allowed herself to breathe. She pressed a hand against the stone railing of the entrance steps, steadying herself, willing her racing heart to slow down. The baby kicked once, gently, as if reminding her that no matter what happened inside that ballroom, there was still a life depending on her to stay strong. She had left Daniel 8 months ago without an explanation, disappearing from the small apartment they once shared, changing her phone number, taking a job under a different last name at a temporary staffing agency. She had told herself it was for the best. She had overheard the conversation between his mother and his father, discussing the merger with the Ashford family, discussing how convenient it would be for Daniel to marry into that kind of wealth and influence. She had heard his mother say the words plainly, that Grace was a distraction he could not afford, a mistake that needed to disappear quietly before it became a scandal. So she disappeared. She told no one where she went. She found work wherever she could, moved into a small apartment on the edge of the city, and prepared to raise her child alone. She never intended to see Daniel again. She certainly never intended to see him standing beside another woman, engaged, glowing under the chandeliers of his family's biggest gala of the year. Behind her, the heavy glass doors of the ballroom swung open. Grace turned, expecting security, expecting someone sent to make sure she left the property without causing further embarrassment. Instead, it was Daniel, his jacket unbuttoned, his tie loosened as though he had pulled at it the moment he stepped outside. "Grace," he said quietly, and the sound of her name in his voice nearly broke the composure she had fought so hard to keep. She turned away from him, walking quickly down the steps toward the street where taxis waited near the curb. Daniel followed, calling her name again, but she did not stop. She had rehearsed this moment 100 times in her mind, imagining what she would say if she ever saw him again. But standing there in the cold with her cheeks still stinging and her heart pounding, every rehearsed sentence disappeared from her memory. "Please," he said, finally catching up to her, stepping in front of her so she had no choice but to stop. "Just give me a moment. That's all I ask." Grace looked up at him, taking in the details she had once memorized so easily. The small scar above his eyebrow, the way his jaw tightened when he was nervous. He looked older somehow, tired in a way she did not remember, but none of that mattered anymore. She had built a new life without him, and she intended to protect that life at any cost. "There is nothing to say," she told him, her voice steadier than she expected. "You have somewhere to be. Your fiancé is waiting." She turned to leave again, but Daniel's gaze dropped to her belly, and whatever composure he had been holding on to shattered completely. Grace watched the realization settle over his face, slow and devastating, as he understood exactly what he was looking at. "Is that mine?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Grace did not answer right away. The street noise around them seemed to fade into the background, the honking cars, the distant laughter from the gala still going on behind the glass doors, all of it disappearing until there was only the question hanging in the air between them. Finally she spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "It does not matter anymore," she said. "I did not come here to find you. I came here to deliver paperwork. Now, if you will excuse me, I have somewhere to be as well." She stepped around him and walked to the nearest taxi, sliding into the back seat before he could say another word. Through the window, she watched him standing on the sidewalk, his hands running through his hair, his expression a mixture of shock and something that looked almost like fear. As the taxi pulled away, Grace allowed herself one glance back, and she saw Charlotte standing in the doorway of the ballroom, watching the entire exchange with narrowed eyes. Grace faced forward again, resting a hand on her belly, willing her breathing to steady. She had wanted to disappear quietly, to raise her child far from the reach of the Whitfield family and everything that came with their name. But the moment Daniel's eyes met hers in that ballroom, she knew quiet disappearance was no longer an option. Somehow, some way, her past had found her again, and there would be no simple way to walk away from it a second time. By the time she reached her small apartment above a bakery on the quieter side of the city, her phone had already begun buzzing with messages from coworkers who had heard about the incident at the gala. Word traveled fast among the staffing agency employees, and by morning everyone would know the story, twisted and exaggerated, painting her as the woman who tried to cause a scene at the biggest event of the season. Grace sat down on the edge of her bed, her hands trembling slightly as she finally allowed the tears to fall. She was not crying because of the slap, though her cheek still ached faintly. She was crying because for one moment, standing in front of Daniel, she had felt something she thought she buried a long time ago. And now, with her secret exposed and her carefully built life beginning to crack at the edges, she understood that everything she had worked so hard to protect was about to be tested in ways she never could have imagined. She lay back against her pillow, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the city outside her window. Somewhere across town, in a mansion she would never set foot in again, Daniel Whitfield was likely staring at his own ceiling, wrestling with a truth that had just upended everything he thought he understood about his life. And somewhere in that same mansion, Charlotte Ashford was already making plans that would soon threaten everything Grace had left to protect. The staffing agency terminated Grace's contract before she had even finished her morning coffee. Her supervisor, a nervous man named Peter Doyle, called her at 7 in the morning, his voice apologetic but firm, explaining that the Whitfield Corporation had requested she never be assigned to any of their events again. He did not mention the slap. He did not need to. Grace understood immediately that the story had already spread through every level of the company, distorted into a version where she was the aggressor, the desperate outsider who had tried to cause trouble at a private event. She sat at her small kitchen table, phone still warm in her hand, staring at the wall without really seeing it. The rent on her apartment was due in 9 days. Her savings, carefully built over months of extra shifts and skipped meals, would cover perhaps 2 more months if she was careful. And now, without the agency's steady stream of assignments, she had no idea where her next paycheck would come from. She thought about calling her sister, but they had not spoken in over a year, not since their parents cut Grace off completely, for reasons that went back further than anyone in her family liked to discuss. She thought about her old friends from university, but pride kept her from reaching out. The same pride that had convinced her disappearing quietly was better than staying and fighting for a place beside a man whose family clearly did not want her there. By mid-afternoon, a knock sounded at her door. Grace opened it expecting her landlord, a kind older woman named Ruth, who occasionally checked in on her tenants, but instead found Daniel standing in the hallway, his coat still damp from the rain outside, his eyes red as though he had not slept at all. "I am not here to cause trouble," he said quickly, before Grace could close the door. "I just need 5 minutes. Please." Grace hesitated, her hand still on the doorframe, torn between the urge to shut it in his face and the exhaustion that made arguing feel impossible. Finally, she stepped aside and let him in, though she kept her arms crossed tightly over her chest as he entered the small apartment. The place was modest, a single bedroom with a kitchenette and a window that overlooked the alley behind the bakery downstairs. Daniel took it in slowly, his gaze lingering on the second-hand crib folded in the corner, the small stack of baby clothes sitting on top of a dresser, evidence of a life he had known nothing about. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly. Grace sat down on the edge of the couch, finally allowing her arms to relax. "Long enough," she answered. "I found out a few weeks after I left. I did not tell you because by then, I had already heard the conversation between your parents. I heard your mother say I was a mistake that needed to disappear before it became public knowledge. I decided I would rather disappear on my own terms than be pushed out on theirs." Daniel's jaw tightened, and for a moment he said nothing, processing the weight of what she had just told him. "That is not true," he finally said. "Or at least, it should not have mattered. I would have chosen you. I would have told my parents exactly where they could put their merger plans." Grace shook her head, a tired laugh escaping her despite the tension in the room. "You are engaged to Charlotte Ashford," she said. "Whatever you believe you would have done does not change what actually happened. You let your family arrange your future without a single word of protest, and I was the one who paid the price for staying quiet." Daniel sat down across from her, running a hand through his damp hair. "I did not choose Charlotte because I wanted her," he said. "My father arranged the engagement after you left. I was drowning in the company, trying to prove myself capable of running it one day, and I let myself get swept into something I never fully agreed to. That does not excuse it. I know that. But I need you to understand that I never stopped thinking about you." Grace looked away, unwilling to let his words soften the walls she had spent months building. "It does not matter now," she said quietly. "I have a life here. A small one, but it is mine, and soon it will belong to my daughter as well. I do not need anything from you or your family." "A daughter," Daniel repeated, something shifting in his expression, softer now, almost hopeful despite the circumstances. Grace nodded, one hand resting on her belly out of habit. "Yes," she said, "a daughter." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, staring at the floor as though searching for the right words among the wreckage of the last 24 hours. "Let me help you," he finally said. "Not because I feel obligated, but because she is my child too, and I want to be part of her life, whatever that looks like for you and for me." Grace studied him carefully, trying to gauge whether his words carried any real weight or whether they were simply the reaction of a man overwhelmed by sudden and unexpected news. "I do not want your money," she said firmly. "I do not want to be someone's secret arrangement while you continue your engagement to another woman." "I called off nothing yet," Daniel admitted, "and I understand if that makes trusting me difficult, but I promise you, Grace, I am not going to walk away pretending none of this happened. I cannot undo the past 8 months, but I can be honest about what happens next." Grace did not respond right away. Instead, she stood and walked to the window, watching rain drip steadily from the fire escape outside. She thought about the years she had spent building walls around herself, first after her family disowned her, then again after she left Daniel, each wall constructed for the sole purpose of protecting herself from further heartbreak. She was not ready to trust him, not fully, not yet, but something in his voice, some quiet sincerity beneath the exhaustion, made her hesitate before shutting him out completely. "You should go," she finally said, though her voice lacked its earlier sharpness. "I need time to think. This is a lot to process in one day." Daniel nodded, rising slowly from the couch. He paused near the door, turning back to look at her one final time. "I am not going to disappear this time," he said. "Whatever you decide, I will respect it. But I am not walking away from my daughter, and I am not walking away from you without at least trying to make things right." After he left, Grace sat alone in the quiet apartment for a long time, listening to the rain tapping against the window, replaying the conversation over and over in her mind. Part of her wanted to believe him. Part of her remembered exactly why she had left in the first place, and that part refused to let her guard down so easily. Across the city, in a penthouse suite overlooking the financial district, Charlotte Ashford paced back and forth across the marble floor, her phone pressed tightly against her ear. She had spent the entire day making calls, gathering information, trying to piece together exactly who the pregnant woman from the gala truly was, and why Daniel had reacted the way he did. Her assistant, a sharp young woman named Vivian Harlow, finally called back with preliminary findings. Her name is Grace Bennett, Vivian reported. She worked temporary assignments through a local staffing agency. Before that, records get thin. It looks like she changed her last name at some point, possibly to distance herself from a wealthier family background. Charlotte's eyes narrowed as she processed the information. Distance herself, she repeated. From what family exactly? I am still working on that, Vivian admitted. There is a gap in her records around 6 years ago. Whatever happened, it looks deliberate, like someone wanted certain details buried. Charlotte walked to the window, staring out at the city lights below, her mind racing through possibilities. She had built her entire future around the merger between the Ashford and Whitfield families, a partnership years in the making, one that would secure both companies' dominance in the industry for the next generation. She had not spent years positioning herself for this marriage only to watch it crumble because of some forgotten woman from Daniel's past. Find out everything, Charlotte instructed, her voice cold and deliberate. I do not care what it costs or how long it takes. If this woman thinks she can walk back into Daniel's life and threaten everything I have worked for, she will learn very quickly how wrong she is. Vivian hesitated before responding. And if she truly is connected to the child Daniel fathered, what would you like me to do with that information? Charlotte's expression hardened, her reflection staring back at her in the dark glass of the window. We use it, she said simply. Whatever leverage we can find, we use it. I did not come this far to lose everything to a nobody in a second-hand dress. As Vivian ended the call to continue her investigation, Charlotte remained by the window, turning the situation over in her mind, calculating her next move with the same precision she applied to every business decision she had ever made. She refused to believe that a woman with no name, no fortune, and no family standing could pose any real threat to her carefully constructed future. But something about the way Daniel had looked at Grace during the gala nagged at the back of her mind. A flicker of concern she quickly buried beneath her determination to protect what she considered rightfully hers. Meanwhile, Grace spent the following days searching for new work, sending out applications to every company she could think of, growing more anxious with each unanswered message. The rumors from the gala had followed her further than she anticipated, several potential employers recognizing her name and politely declining to schedule interviews, citing vague reasons that Grace understood all too well. On the 4th day, she received an unexpected phone call from a woman named Margaret Ellery, the owner of a small accounting firm on the other side of town. Margaret explained she had heard about the incident at the gala, but did not care for gossip or rumors. She cared only about qualified employees, and Grace's resume showed exactly the kind of experience her firm needed. Grace accepted the position gratefully, relieved to have found somewhere willing to overlook the whispers following her name. The new job kept her busy, filling her days with spreadsheets and client meetings, giving her little time to dwell on Daniel or the uncertainty of what his continued presence in her life might mean. Still, he called every few days, always respectful, always asking permission before visiting, slowly proving through consistency what his words alone could not. 3 weeks after their conversation in her apartment, Daniel arrived at her door carrying a small gift, a soft blanket meant for the baby, wrapped simply, without any indication of the wealth he came from. Grace accepted it hesitantly, touched despite herself by the simplicity of the gesture. I spoke to my father, Daniel told her as she invited him inside. I told him the engagement to Charlotte needs to end. He did not take it well, but I made myself clear. I cannot build a future with someone while another person carries my child and receives nothing but silence from me. Grace studied his face carefully, searching for any sign of hesitation or regret. What did he say? She asked. He said I was throwing away everything the family worked for, Daniel admitted. He said Charlotte's family would never forgive the insult, and the business partnership would collapse entirely. I told him I would rather lose the partnership than lose the chance to know my daughter. Grace remained quiet for a moment, absorbing the weight of what he had just revealed. Do you understand what you are risking? She finally asked. Charlotte does not seem like the kind of woman who accepts rejection quietly. Daniel's expression grew serious. I know, he said, and I suspect she is already trying to find out everything she can about you. I do not know what she is planning, but I want you to be prepared. Whatever she uncovers, whatever she tries to use against you, I want you to know that I am not going anywhere. Grace nodded slowly, appreciating his honesty even as a quiet unease settled over her. She had spent years burying the details of her past, details even Daniel knew nothing about, details that involved her real family, her real name, and a betrayal so significant it had forced her father into hiding, years before she ever met Daniel. If Charlotte's investigation dug deep enough, she would eventually uncover secrets Grace had hoped would remain buried forever. As Daniel prepared to leave that evening, Grace walked him to the door, her hand resting against the frame. Thank you for telling me the truth, she said quietly. Whatever happens next, I appreciate that you are not hiding things from me anymore. Daniel paused at the threshold, looking back at her with an expression that carried both hope and uncertainty. We are going to figure this out together, he said. Whatever Charlotte tries to do, whatever secrets come to light, I promise you will not face it alone this time. After he left, Grace closed the door and leaned against it, exhaling slowly. She thought about her father, a man the world believed had died in a car accident nearly 6 years ago, a man who had actually gone into hiding after a business rival orchestrated a scheme that destroyed his company and nearly cost him his life. She thought about the connections between powerful families in this city, connections that ran deeper and darker than most people realized, and she wondered, with a growing sense of dread, whether the Ashford family's involvement in her life was truly a coincidence, or whether the past she thought she had escaped was finally catching up to claim her once again. Vivian Harlow sat in her small office late into the night, surrounded by folders and printouts, piecing together fragments of a story that seemed to grow stranger the deeper she dug. Grace Bennett was not the name on any birth certificate she could locate. There was no record of a Grace Bennett before the age of 22, no school transcripts, no family history, nothing but a sudden appearance in public records around the time she would have finished university. Vivian leaned back in her chair, rubbing her tired eyes, and decided to approach the problem from a different angle. If Grace Bennett did not exist before a certain point, then perhaps she had existed under an entirely different name. Vivian pulled up old news archives, searching for any young woman who disappeared from public life around the same period, someone whose family history might explain the elaborate effort to erase her past. It took nearly a week of searching before Vivian found what she was looking for, buried in an old business journal article about the sudden collapse of Sinclair Manufacturing 6 years earlier. The article mentioned the company's founder, Arthur Sinclair, a respected industrialist whose company had been driven into bankruptcy following a series of scandals involving falsified safety reports. Arthur Sinclair had died in a car accident shortly after the company's collapse, leaving behind a wife who had passed years earlier and one surviving daughter, a young woman named Grace Sinclair, who disappeared from public records almost immediately after her father's death. Vivian stared at the old photograph accompanying the article, a grainy image of a teenage girl standing beside her father at a company event years before the scandal broke. The resemblance to the woman from the gala was unmistakable, the same eyes, the same quiet strength in her expression. She brought the information to Charlotte the following morning, spreading the printed articles across the glass table in Charlotte's office. Charlotte read through the material slowly, her expression shifting from curiosity to something colder, more calculating, as she absorbed the implications. Sinclair Manufacturing, Charlotte murmured, tapping a finger against the article. That name sounds familiar. It should, Vivian said carefully. Sinclair Manufacturing was a major competitor to several companies in this city before its collapse, including, if the old records are accurate, a company owned by your father. Charlotte looked up sharply. Explain, she said. Vivian pulled out another folder, this one containing financial records she had obtained through contacts within several banking institutions. According to these documents, your father's company acquired several key contracts that previously belonged to Sinclair Manufacturing, almost immediately following the safety scandal that destroyed Arthur Sinclair's reputation. The timing is suspicious, to say the least. Charlotte sat back in her chair, processing the information with a mixture of unease and calculation. Are you suggesting my father had something to do with the collapse of that company? She asked, though her tone made clear she already suspected the answer. I am suggesting it is worth investigating further, Vivian replied carefully. If Grace Bennett is truly Grace Sinclair, and if her father's downfall was engineered rather than accidental, this could become a very complicated situation for your family, especially if she or Daniel ever discover the connection. Charlotte remained silent for a long moment, staring out the window at the city below. She had spent her entire life benefiting from her father's success, never questioning too deeply how that success had been built. The idea that some of it might rest on the deliberate destruction of another family unsettled her, but not enough to change her priorities. Her engagement, her future, her position within the business world all depended on the merger with the Whitfield family proceeding without complication. She would not allow a woman from a dead company's ashes to threaten everything she had worked to secure. Keep digging, Charlotte instructed. I need to know exactly what really happened to Arthur Sinclair, and I need to know before Daniel or that woman figures it out first. Whatever advantage this gives us, I intend to use it. Meanwhile, across the city, Daniel had begun his own investigation, driven by a promise he made to himself the night Grace revealed she was carrying his child. He hired a private researcher, a meticulous man named Peter Halloway, to look into the strange gaps in Grace's history, hoping to understand what had shaped her into someone so guarded, so quick to disappear, rather than fight for herself. Peter's findings arrived within days, and Daniel read through them alone in his office late one evening, the city lights glittering outside his window, as he absorbed the truth about the woman he loved. Grace Sinclair, daughter of Arthur Sinclair, a man whose company had been destroyed by a scandal that Peter's research suggested was entirely fabricated. According to internal documents Peter had managed to obtain, the safety reports that supposedly proved Sinclair Manufacturing had knowingly sold defective equipment were altered after the fact, the original reports showing no such violations. Someone had gone to great lengths to frame Arthur Sinclair, destroying his company, his reputation, and ultimately, it seemed, driving him to a car accident that Peter's research suggested might not have been entirely accidental. Daniel felt sick reading through the details, understanding now why Grace had built such careful walls around herself, why she trusted so few people, why she had chosen to disappear rather than risk further heartbreak. He also noticed, with growing dread, a name mentioned repeatedly throughout the financial records Peter had uncovered, a name he recognized immediately: Gerald Ashford. Charlotte's father had been the primary beneficiary of Sinclair Manufacturing's collapse, acquiring the company's most valuable contracts within weeks of the scandal breaking. The timing, the financial records, everything pointed toward a deliberate scheme orchestrated to eliminate a competitor and seize control of an entire industry sector. Daniel closed the folder slowly, leaning back in his chair, trying to process the magnitude of what he had just learned. If this information became public, it would not only destroy Gerald Ashford's reputation, it would likely unravel the entire merger his own family had spent years negotiating. But more importantly, it would give Grace something she had been denied for 6 years, the truth about what really happened to her father, and perhaps, finally, some measure of justice. He called Grace that same night, his voice tight with urgency as he asked her to meet him the following morning. When she arrived at the small coffee shop near her apartment, she could immediately see something had changed in his expression, a mixture of anger and determination she had not seen before. I need to tell you something, Daniel said, sliding the folder across the table toward her, and I need you to prepare yourself, because it is not going to be easy to hear. Grace opened the folder slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she recognized her father's name on the first page. She read through the documents in silence, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief, to something far more painful as the truth of what happened to her father finally became clear. They framed him, she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. All these years I believed the accident was simply bad luck, that the scandal destroyed him because he made a mistake somewhere along the way. But this was deliberate. Someone did this to him on purpose. Daniel reached across the table, gently covering her hand with his own. Gerald Ashford's company benefited directly from your father's downfall, he said quietly. Charlotte's father orchestrated this, Grace. I do not know all the details yet, but the pattern is too consistent to be coincidence. Grace sat back in her chair, staring at the documents scattered across the table. Memories of her father flooding back. Memories of the man who had built his company from nothing, who had taught her the value of honesty and hard work, who had died believing his own mistakes had cost him everything he built. Learning now that his downfall had been engineered by someone else entirely, filled her with a grief she had not expected, layered beneath a rising sense of anger she had spent years suppressing. "What do we do now?" she finally asked, looking up at Daniel with an expression that mixed exhaustion with a fierce, quiet determination. "We expose it," Daniel said firmly, carefully, and with enough evidence that no one can dismiss it or bury it again. But we cannot move too quickly. If Charlotte or her father suspect we know the truth before we are ready to act, they will find a way to discredit the evidence or destroy it entirely. Grace nodded slowly, closing the folder and holding it against her chest, as though protecting the fragile truth contained within its pages. For 6 years, she had carried the weight of her father's supposed failure, believing she had inherited nothing but the ashes of a company destroyed by his own mistakes. Now, armed with proof that painted an entirely different picture, she felt something shift within her, a resolve hardening beneath the grief. "I want them to know what they did," she said quietly, "not just for my sake, but for my daughter. I do not want her growing up believing her grandfather was a failure when the truth is he was betrayed by people who valued profit over honesty." Daniel squeezed her hand gently. "We will make sure the truth comes out," he promised, "but we need to be smart about how we do it." As they sat together in the quiet coffee shop, neither of them noticed the woman sitting 2 tables away, sipping her coffee slowly while pretending to read a magazine, her phone recording every word of their conversation. Vivian Harlow had followed Daniel that morning, curious about his sudden urgency, and now she possessed exactly the information Charlotte needed to move forward with whatever plan she intended to execute. Vivian left the coffee shop quietly, her phone already dialing Charlotte's number before she had even reached her car. "They know," Vivian said the moment Charlotte answered. "Daniel found the connection between your father and the Sinclair manufacturing collapse. He has documents, and it sounds like they are planning to expose everything." Charlotte's grip tightened around her own phone, her mind racing through the implications of what she had just heard. "When?" she demanded. "When are they planning to release this information?" "I do not know exactly," Vivian admitted, "but they mentioned being careful, taking their time to gather enough evidence. I would guess they intend to expose it publicly, likely at an event significant enough to guarantee maximum attention." Charlotte thought immediately of the upcoming shareholders meeting scheduled for the following month, an event that would bring together every major investor and board member connected to both the Whitfield and Ashford companies. It was exactly the kind of stage Daniel would choose if he wanted to ensure the truth could not be quietly suppressed or ignored. "We move first," Charlotte decided, her voice cold and resolute. "If they intend to use the shareholders meeting to expose my father, we control the narrative before they ever get the chance. I want everything you can find on Grace Sinclair's pregnancy, her current living situation, anything that could be used to paint her as unstable or manipulative before she ever has the chance to present her evidence." Vivian hesitated slightly before responding. "And if the evidence against your father is accurate," she asked carefully, "what happens then?" Charlotte's silence stretched long enough that Vivian wondered if the call had disconnected. Finally Charlotte spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "Then we make sure no one believes it," she said, "whatever it takes." As Charlotte ended the call and began outlining her strategy, she remained unaware that her own carefully constructed plans were about to collide with a truth far larger and far more damaging than she anticipated. A truth that would not only threaten her engagement, but ultimately reshape everything she believed about her family's success and the price others had paid for it. The shareholders' meeting arrived faster than anyone anticipated, the grand conference hall of the Whitfield Corporation filled with investors, board members, and executives from both companies involved in the pending merger. Grace stood backstage, her hands folded tightly over her rounded belly, watching through a small gap in the curtains, as the room continued to fill with people who held no idea their entire understanding of two powerful families was about to change forever. Daniel found her there moments before the meeting began, his expression calm despite the tension radiating from his shoulders. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly. Grace nodded, though her heart pounded rapidly beneath her composed exterior. I have waited 6 years to understand what really happened to my father, she said. I am ready to make sure everyone else understands it too. Across the room, Charlotte sat in the front row beside her father, Gerald Ashford, unaware that the meeting she believed she controlled was about to unravel in ways she had not fully anticipated. She had spent the past weeks preparing her own counterattack, gathering whatever information Vivian could find about Grace's background, ready to present her as an unstable and manipulative outsider the moment any accusation against her father surfaced. The meeting began with routine business matters, quarterly earnings, merger timelines, standard presentations that kept the room's attention only partially engaged. Charlotte watched Daniel carefully throughout the proceedings, noting his composed demeanor, waiting for any sign of the confrontation she anticipated. When the floor finally opened for additional statements from board members, Charlotte rose from her seat before Daniel had the chance to speak first. I believe there is something the board should be aware of, Charlotte announced, her voice carrying clearly across the silent room. It concerns a woman who caused a disturbance at our recent company gala. A woman who has since been in contact with Daniel Whitfield under circumstances that raise serious concerns about her intentions. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as Charlotte continued, painting a careful picture of Grace as an opportunist, someone who had inserted herself into Daniel's life at a convenient moment, someone whose sudden pregnancy claim threatened to derail an important business partnership through manipulation rather than truth. She spoke with practiced confidence, her words designed to plant doubt before any counter-argument could take root. Grace stepped out from behind the curtain the moment Charlotte finished speaking, walking calmly to the front of the room despite the surprised whispers that followed her entrance. She placed a folder on the podium and looked out at the crowd, her expression steady despite the pounding of her heart. "My name is Grace Sinclair," she began, and the room fell silent at the sound of her real name. Some of you may recognize that name from many years ago, connected to a company called Sinclair Manufacturing, a company my father built from nothing before it was destroyed by a scandal that ended his career, and ultimately his life. She opened the folder, presenting copies of the documents Daniel had helped her gather, evidence showing the falsified safety reports, the timeline of Gerald Ashford's company acquiring Sinclair's most valuable contracts within weeks of the scandal breaking, financial records that painted an undeniable picture of deliberate sabotage rather than genuine business failure. For 6 years I believed my father's downfall was his own mistake, Grace continued, her voice growing steadier with each word. I have since learned that his company was deliberately framed, his reputation destroyed by someone who profited directly from his ruin. That someone was Gerald Ashford. Gasps spread through the room as attendees turned to look at Gerald, whose face had gone pale, his composed businessman exterior cracking under the sudden weight of public exposure. Charlotte rose to her feet, attempting to interject, but Daniel stood as well, his voice cutting through the rising chaos. I have reviewed every document presented here, Daniel said firmly, addressing the board directly. I can confirm the evidence is authentic. Gerald Ashford orchestrated the destruction of Sinclair Manufacturing to eliminate a competitor and secure contracts that rightfully belonged to another company. This is not speculation. This is documented fact. Charlotte's face flushed with anger and panic as she realized her carefully planned narrative was collapsing in real time. She turned to Daniel, her voice sharp with desperation. You would destroy our family's partnership over unproven allegations from a woman clearly seeking financial gain, she said, though her voice wavered slightly, betraying the confidence she tried to project. Daniel turned to face her directly, his expression calm but resolute. This has nothing to do with financial gain, he said. Grace never asked me for anything. She never asked for recognition, for money, or for revenge. All of this evidence exists because the truth deserves to be known, regardless of how inconvenient it is for either of our families. He paused, looking around the room at the stunned faces of board members and investors before continuing. I also want to be clear about something else, he said. Grace is carrying my child. I have known this for several weeks now, and I should have addressed it publicly sooner, rather than allowing rumors and assumptions to spread unchecked. Charlotte, I am ending our engagement, effective immediately. I cannot build a future with someone while denying the reality of the family I am already responsible for. The room erupted into hushed conversation, board members exchanging startled glances, investors whispering among themselves as they processed the sudden collapse of what had been positioned as a landmark business partnership. Charlotte stood frozen for a moment, her carefully constructed world crumbling in front of an audience of the city's most influential business figures, before finally turning and walking swiftly toward the exit, her father following closely behind her, his own reputation now hanging by a thread. Grace remained standing at the podium, watching the chaos unfold with a strange sense of calm settling over her. For 6 years she had carried the burden of her father's supposed failure alone, believing she had nothing left of his legacy except painful memories. Now, standing in front of the very people who had once benefited from her father's downfall, she finally felt the weight of that burden begin to lift. As the meeting adjourned in disarray, several board members approached Grace directly, offering quiet words of sympathy and, in some cases, outright apologies for the industry's failure to question the circumstances of Sinclair Manufacturing's collapse at the time. One older gentleman, a longtime business associate of her father's, named Walter Higgins, took her hand gently and told her that Arthur Sinclair had always been one of the most honest men he had ever worked with, and that the industry owed her family a debt long overdue. Daniel found her afterward, standing near the large windows overlooking the city, watching the late afternoon light stretch across the skyline. "Are you all right?" he asked gently, coming to stand beside her. Grace nodded slowly, though tears had begun to form in her eyes, tears she no longer felt the need to hide. "I finally feel like people believe me," she said quietly. "Like my father's memory finally means something other than failure." Daniel wrapped an arm gently around her shoulders, careful and respectful, giving her the space to feel whatever emotions surfaced without pressure or expectation. "It was never a failure," he said softly. "It was a betrayal, and today, everyone in that room finally understands the difference." Meanwhile, across the city, Charlotte sat alone in her penthouse, staring blankly at the television, where local business news channels had already begun reporting on the shocking developments from the shareholders' meeting. Her phone buzzed relentlessly with messages from friends, colleagues, and reporters seeking comment, but she ignored every single one, her mind replaying the moment her carefully built future collapsed in front of an audience she had spent years trying to impress. Her father entered the room quietly, his usual commanding presence noticeably diminished. "The board is already discussing removing me from my position," he said, his voice hollow. "Several major clients have already withdrawn their contracts pending further investigation." Charlotte turned to look at him, searching his face for the confidence she had relied upon her entire life, but finding only exhaustion and defeat. "Did you actually do it?" she asked quietly. "Did you really destroy that man's company just to secure a few contracts?" Gerald did not answer immediately, and his silence told her everything she needed to know. Charlotte closed her eyes, feeling the full weight of her family's legacy crumbling around her, understanding now that the engagement she had fought so hard to protect had never been the true threat to her future. The truth itself had always been the greater danger, patiently waiting years for the right moment to surface and demand accountability from everyone who had benefited from its suppression. As evening settled over the city, Grace stood once again at her apartment window, watching the same skyline she had grown accustomed to during her months of quiet, careful living. Daniel stood beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, both of them silently absorbing the magnitude of everything that had unfolded throughout the day. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Grace felt something resembling peace settle over her, knowing that whatever challenges remained ahead, she would no longer face them while carrying the false burden of her father's supposed failure, and she would no longer face them entirely alone. 3 months passed, and the city's business circles were still adjusting to the aftermath of the shareholders' meeting that had exposed Gerald Ashford's decades-old scheme against Sinclair Manufacturing. Gerald had resigned from his position amid mounting legal pressure, and several of his company's major partnerships had dissolved as former clients distanced themselves from the scandal. Charlotte, once celebrated as the city's most promising young heiress, had retreated almost entirely from public life, her engagement to Daniel, a distant memory overshadowed by her family's collapsing reputation. Grace, meanwhile, found herself navigating an entirely different set of challenges, the practical realities of preparing for her daughter's arrival, while slowly rebuilding the pieces of a legacy she once believed was lost forever. With the truth about her father's downfall now public record, several former employees of Sinclair Manufacturing had reached out to her directly, expressing interest in helping her rebuild the company under new leadership, if she was willing to take on such a task. She sat one afternoon in the small office she had rented on the outskirts of the city, reviewing documents with Walter Higgins, the elderly businessman who had approached her after the shareholders' meeting, with quiet words of respect for her father's memory. Walter had spent decades working alongside her father before Sinclair Manufacturing's collapse, and his knowledge of the industry proved invaluable as Grace considered the possibility of reviving her father's company. "Your father built something remarkable," Walter told her, spreading old blueprints and financial records across the table between them. "It would be a shame to let his vision remain buried simply because of what happened to him. If you are willing, I believe there are enough of us who remember his work fondly to help you rebuild it properly this time." Grace studied the documents carefully, feeling a mixture of excitement and apprehension at the possibility unfolding in front of her. "I do not have my father's business experience," she admitted honestly. "I would need guidance, real guidance, not just sympathy." Walter smiled gently, the wrinkles around his eyes deepening with warmth. "That is exactly what I am offering," he said. "Guidance, experience, and the kind of loyalty that does not disappear when circumstances become difficult. Your father earned that loyalty many years ago. It seems only right that his daughter should benefit from it now." Over the following weeks, Grace began the careful process of rebuilding Sinclair Manufacturing, working alongside Walter and a small group of former employees who remembered her father's leadership fondly. Daniel supported her efforts quietly, offering advice when asked but never overstepping, allowing Grace to reclaim her father's legacy on her own terms, rather than through his family's influence or resources. Their relationship, too, continued evolving slowly and carefully, built now on honesty, rather than the secrecy that had once driven Grace away in the first place. Daniel visited regularly, attending prenatal appointments whenever his schedule allowed, slowly earning back the trust that circumstances beyond his control had once damaged so severely. One evening, as Grace sat on the small balcony of her apartment, watching the sunset paint the sky in soft shades of orange and pink, Daniel arrived carrying a simple bouquet of flowers, nothing extravagant, nothing designed to impress, just a quiet gesture of affection that had become characteristic of the way their relationship had grown. "I have been thinking about something," Daniel said, settling into the chair beside her. Grace glanced at him curiously, noting the slight nervousness in his expression, an uncertainty she had rarely seen from him since the shareholders' meeting. "What is it?" she asked. Daniel took a deep breath, reaching into his coat pocket and retrieving a small velvet box, holding it carefully in his hands rather than presenting it immediately. "I know we have been through more than most couples experience in years, all compressed into just a few months," he said. "I am not asking this because of obligation, or because of our daughter, though she matters more to me than I ever could have imagined before all of this began. I am asking because somewhere along the way, through everything that has happened, I fell in love with you all over again, more deeply and more honestly than I ever did before." He opened the box, revealing a simple, elegant ring, far less extravagant than anything Charlotte would have expected, but perfectly suited to the quiet, genuine life Grace had built for herself. "Marry me," Daniel said softly. "Not because it makes sense for our families, not because of business or convenience, but because I want to build a real life with you and our daughter, built entirely on honesty this time." Grace stared at the ring, then at Daniel's earnest expression, feeling tears gather in her eyes as she considered everything they had overcome together. She thought about the humiliation of that first night at the gala, the months of uncertainty that followed, the painful truth about her father's downfall, and the slow, careful rebuilding of trust between herself and the man sitting beside her now. "Yes," she said finally, her voice trembling with emotion. "Yes, I will marry you." Daniel slipped the ring onto her finger gently, and for a long moment, they simply sat together in comfortable silence, watching the last colors of sunset fade into the deepening evening sky, both of them finally allowing themselves to feel hopeful about the future ahead. Grace gave birth to a healthy daughter 3 weeks later, a small, bright-eyed girl they named Amelia, after Grace's mother, who had passed away when Grace was still a child. Daniel remained by her side throughout the entire delivery, and when he held his daughter for the first time, Grace watched his composed businessman exterior melt away completely, replaced by an expression of pure, uncomplicated joy. 6 months after Amelia's birth, Sinclair Manufacturing officially reopened under Grace's leadership, now operating with modernized practices and a renewed reputation built on the same honesty and integrity her father had once championed before his downfall. The reopening ceremony drew far more attention than Grace had anticipated, former clients and industry figures gathering to witness the rebirth of a company many had assumed was gone forever. Walter stood proudly beside her during the ceremony, along with several other former employees who had chosen to return once word spread of the company's revival. Daniel attended as well, holding Amelia in his arms as Grace addressed the small crowd gathered outside the newly renovated factory building. "My father built this company on principles of honesty and hard work," Grace said, her voice steady and confident in a way that would have seemed impossible to her just a year earlier. Those principles were betrayed by people who valued profit over integrity. But today, we begin again, carrying his vision forward the way it always deserved to be honored. The crowd applauded warmly, and Grace felt a deep sense of satisfaction settle over her, knowing that her father's legacy, once buried beneath false scandal and quiet suffering, had finally been restored to its rightful place. She glanced toward Daniel, who smiled at her proudly. Amelia's small hand wrapped around his finger, and felt gratitude for how far they had traveled together since that painful night at the gala so many months ago. News of Charlotte occasionally reached Grace through mutual acquaintances, stories of a quieter, more subdued life far removed from the glamorous events she had once dominated so effortlessly. Charlotte had reportedly moved to another city, attempting to rebuild her own reputation, away from the shadow of her father's scandal, though whether she ever truly succeeded remained uncertain. Grace felt no satisfaction in Charlotte's downfall, only a quiet acknowledgement that actions, eventually, tend to carry consequences, whether immediate or delayed. As the reopening ceremony concluded and guests began to disperse, Grace walked slowly through the newly renovated factory floor, running her fingers along machinery that once belonged to her father, machinery that would now help build a future for her own daughter. She thought about the woman she had been at the gala all those months ago, humiliated and dismissed, treated as though she were nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle standing in someone else's way. She was no longer that woman. She stood now as the confident leader of a rebuilt company, a mother to a healthy daughter, and soon, a wife to a man who had proven through consistent action, rather than empty promises, that he was worthy of the trust she had slowly, carefully extended to him once again. That evening, as the factory emptied and the sun began its slow descent behind the city skyline, Grace stood outside the building with Daniel and Amelia, watching the golden light reflect off the newly polished Sinclair Manufacturing sign above the entrance. She thought about everything that had led her to this moment, every painful step, every difficult truth uncovered, every quiet act of courage required to reach a place of genuine peace and stability. Whatever challenges awaited them in the future, Grace faced them now not as the nobody dismissed so callously at that gala, but as a woman who had reclaimed her name, her family's legacy, and her own quiet, unshakable strength, standing tall beside the people she loved, finally free from the shadows of a past that no longer held any power over her.